Welcome to this tutorial in building an AR app from an engineering model. The episode has been split up in 3 different segments. One covering the basics of materials. The second one will create the materials for the robot using an add-on in Blender. And the third one will look at the topology of the robot. Sometimes when you import an engineering model, you find some artifacts on the model itself which influence the way it appears. So those are the 3 aspects we're gonna cover. Looking a little bit deeper at this tutorial, we'll cover the basics of PBR, physically based rendering first, which is creation of realistic materials. Then we'll take a look at the effect of lighting on materials, as these play also a very important role. Then we're going to create 2 types of materials, one using images called textures, and we're going to create one procedurally, which is more of a mathematical way to create materials. Once we have covered that, we'll take a look at UV unwrapping, which is needed for the correct application of some materials on the 3D object. But that's enough said, let's take a look. Let's take a look at some of the examples which have been created. The first one obviously being a very worn robot. I guess the theme for this tutorial is worn robots anyways. So if we take a look at the top part, we see some abrasion going on. There's a light shining on it and the light gets reflected back where the abrasion is going on, and not so much on the other parts. On this yellow part, you can see it's very reflective. The light gets bounced back and you can almost see the environment in this material, so it's extremely glossy. And this is different than the robot arm here, which is very rough and does not reflect any light. Or on the top part, you can see some scuffing going on with different types of materials, so there is interaction between the 2 materials. And the same type of flaking or rust going on is present on the servo motors. And if you would put that in like a animation and you shine a light on it, you see the light interacts with the material and each of the materials acts differently. And this is what they called physically based rendering, or the material being more or less realistic. So if we continue, let me just clear this and let me see another example. This also being a very worn robot, in this case it's a blue one. You can see some scratches going on here, the scuffing going on here, but the servo motors, as an example, are created in a glossy material, and you can even see the top of them being very reflective, so all these materials act differently as well. And if we look at the last example, is the material which we will be creating in this tutorial. We have an extremely dented or pitted aluminum or steel material, whereas the end of the robot has a black material which has been scarred. And the servo motors are rusted with some flaking on there. But before we start, let's take a little look at the physically based rendering characteristics, and we'll head over to the Adobe website. Understanding how light and materials interact is quite complicated, but I headed over to the Adobe website, and let me just zoom in so you can see the URL if you're interested. It shows the PBR guide, which stands for physically based rendering, which actually means realistic materials. To create realistic materials, you need to understand how light and matter interact. So they have a whole website here. This is only part 1. I'm just scrolling through all of this. You can see there's loads and loads and loads of information about it. But the most important thing is just on the top here, which I need to go here. And if I just underline it, this is the basics of what we're going to achieve. The interaction of light and matter. And this is what's going to make the materials that we will be creating so interesting and look realistic. We need to understand light and matter, and we're going to create those materials in this tutorial. This tutorial is about materials mainly, but as we saw, it's the combination of lighting and materials which make it realistic. And I would like to stress the importance of accurate lighting or mood lighting to create a model that stands out. I took this one robot, and if I were to replace the lighting in the scene, and in this case the floor as well, and replace it by an artificial light, this is what you would end up with. And as you can see, all the details that are present in the model are all washed out, they're blown away. The model does not stand out as much, so you can see the importance of the lighting in this example already. And if I would increase the lighting even further, and this is a very washed out effect which starts to appear. This is not something you want to show. You can even add another floor, you can add some sun lighting, but this is still the artificial lighting scene going on. And the model is not as nice as the original one. Even when you make the floor black, increase the lighting levels, you do get some effects, but still it looks very artificial. Whereas if you put some lighting in there, you can make any type of mood actually, and you can make it more sci-fi. But the importance of the lighting is not to be underestimated. It's just as important as the materials, as those two work together. To give you a basic idea of the different ways to create materials, we are going to look at using textures to create a material and create them procedurally. For this reason, I'm going to set up a little scene consisting of a cube and a plane. And let me just scale this up a little bit. There we are. So this is the scene we will be using. I'll create a stone texture on the bottom and then the metal one on top. So at least we get an understanding of what the terms all mean. Just to let everyone know, I will be using the cycles, and we can go here, cycles render engine on my GPU, which, well, let me select GPU. It's a little bit easier to work with, and we are going to bake out these textures later on in the tutorial, and cycles is easier to use, but both work very, very well. The other thing that you'll be seeing me doing is right here on the top, and let me just indicate what we're going to be working with, which are the render options right here on the top. If I were to, and let me just clear this out, start the render, you can see that the lighting gets projected and the materials as well, although none are applied at this moment. But I can also quickly change the lighting in the scene, so it says scene world right now. I can change this or deselect it, and it gives me the option to select all these predetermined lightings already. And I'll leave this right here. Let me just zoom out, and this is the scene that we've got. And if I turn on the scene world again, you can see that makes a whole lot of difference. As this is unrealistic and there is one light in the scene, which is this one, there is some environmental lighting. But once I change it to the more realistic lighting, then it gets interesting right away. All right, so we have set this up, and now we need to dive in a little bit of theory. I'm going to be using textures for this one, so let me just pull this up a little bit and let me show this, and I'm going to select shader editor, so nothing to see here. And now first I want to apply a material, and there we go. Let me call this floor. Well, let me type floor. I should have typed 2 O's. There we are. And let me just zoom in on this one, and I can zoom in quite a bit with this. So there's a huge node which is presented right here. So the node you're seeing here is so big because the good folks at Blender gave us all options to create almost any type of material using just one node, this big one. And this is the typical way that 3D programs create materials. They're using nodes which are connected. You see on the right hand side there's a material output, and they are connected, and that's how they get all the information. If I just zoom back out again, You see the base color is white, and if I were to select this one and say I want this to be blue, well, that's quite easy. Then it's unrealistic, but then it's blue. I can go back to white, I can make it green, I can even make it metallic if I like, so it's more shiny, or I can make it diffuse. So I can play with all these settings. And let me just make it larger again. We will only be using a few. And this is confusing if you start out with using textures or even procedurally. The ones which are important for us are the base color. We are also interested in metallic, and we are interested in roughness, and we are interested in the normal. The first thing that we want to find are the textures that we want to use. And let me just pull up the websites. It's one of them. So there is a bunch of websites out there offering textures they can use to create realistic materials. I'll show you textures.com, but there are a bunch of them. If you go to library, you can scroll down and you can select any type of the even buildings, but you can also have the blocks, bricks, and so on. Anything you like to place on your materials is available. You need to create an account and then you can download. I'll be downloading it from a website called Polygon. They deliver really high quality textures. I'm not using them a lot, but they are highly recommended if you want to download. I created an account, so I'm logged in already. And if you want to test it out, you can do this for free. You can find the free option right here. Click on free, and those materials you can download for free to test and to try out. And for this purpose, as you can see, I have downloaded the tiles subway. So you click on it, and then I have a free download here. I have a 2K resolution. Click on download, and we can see the textures that we will be using. Once you downloaded the textures and you open up the folder where they're present, you see a bunch of textures included. And especially when you start out with applying the materials or the textures to the materials, this can be pretty confusing. So let me guide you through this quickly. Obviously, there is the big one. And this is the one showing you the material that we will be creating in a second in Blender. But this is the final result. And let me just close this. So this is the one here. If you look at the textures carefully, you see only one of them has a natural color, which is the color one. The other ones are either black and white or grayish, or have a really strange color, like the green one and the purple one. So let's go through them one by one, and I'm gonna select the arrow here. So this is the first one, and it's the ambient occlusion, and that's usually required when you want to emphasize on shadows in like normally a clay model. When you're working without textures, but you want to emphasize specific areas, you use the ambient occlusion. We will not be using it because it's more of an artistic one and it's not part of the PBR or realistic materials. So we can forget about this one. It's more for art use. Then let me just put the arrow back in. I'm gonna mark this one, the bump and the bump, displacement and displacement, and the normal one. These 5 textures all serve the same function. They are slightly different, but they all serve the same purpose of showing some height information or some more realistic details in the height variation. You can choose either one. We will be using the purple one on the bottom, which is the normal. The other ones you can use as well. It depends on your workflow, but all 5 of these serve the height information. So that's that. Then we have glossy. And glossy we will be using as well, because that's gonna tell the computer where to reflect the light back at us. Then there is also the reflection map right here, and I'm putting an arrow right in it. We also will not be using this because it's not part of the PBR workflow. You can use this one if you want to achieve the same result, where is the material reflective and where it is not. But since we are using PBR, we want this more or less to be done automatically, so we can forget about this one. It's not part of the PBR workflow. And we will also not be using the ID map, which is more of a mask where you can change the color of the material. So basically, we are just going to use the color one, we are going to use the glossy one, and we are going to use the normal map. And with just these three maps, we can create the same material as you see here in this example. And let me clear this so you can see it a little bit better. And let's dive in. Let's create this material in Blender on our plane. We're back at the scene with the cube and the plane and the node on the bottom. And let me just make this bigger and put it in the center. The way to add the texture that we just downloaded is by pressing Shift A, and then we're going to select texture. There is a bunch of textures available for us in this field, but we're going to select image texture. And I'm just going to place it here. And here you can see it has a yellow output which says color. And I want to hook it up to the base color, which is yellow as well. So that is good. Let's go to the folder where we stored all the different textures. And we are going to select the color one. Got this one selected and open it up. And you can see it's shown here. And I can drag this out if you like, but I can place it or actually like this, and I can hook it up just by dragging this out. But let me first go back. And if I connect these ones, I get my texture in place directly, as you can see. But it looks very, very flat and unrealistic. And therefore we need to add some height information to this. So let me just make this larger again. And I can follow the same procedure. Shift A to open up the texture, image texture right here. Then I can open this up and go to the directory again where I stored my information. We will be using the normal map. So this is the purple one. Open it up. But now I want to connect a yellow dot color into an purple one, which is not directly possible. So I need a conversion, and this conversion is a vector and it is a normal map. So I can plug the color into the color, and now I can connect the normal to the normal. So let me just go back so you can see what's happening. And I need to increase the strength later on, but let me first connect these. Then let me just increase the strength so you can see the difference. And there you go. You can see already that there is height information included in the texture without any change to geometry. So it's not adding any geometry. It's just giving the illusion actually of height information. As you can see, it's already looking more realistic. And the last step that we want to do is, let me just make this larger again. Let's Shift A. We are going to insert the last texture. And that is the glossy one. And I want to put the glossy into the roughness because those are the same, but they are inverted. So I need to invert the color. There we go. Because I want to have the glossy into the roughness. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but there we are. But we only need 3 textures. And I'm gonna hook this up. And as you can see already, the light coming from the environment and from this light as well. I'm not supposed to move the plane. I was supposed to move the light. There you go. As you can see, right here, you can see that the reflection is only present at the tiles and not inside of in between them, like the concrete or cement, what it is. There I can move the light to the left, I can move the light to the right, and if I can even change the color of the light, you can see the reflection goes along with it. And the reflection stays here. So with these 3 nodes set up, and let me just show them right here. We have defined the same material as we saw on the Polygon website. The top one is connected correctly. I got the color into the color. The second one, as you may remember, was a black and white image. So I should have set this to non-color, as it's only used to give off information on where to reflect the light and where not. And that's also the reason why it is gray on the input side right here. It's only used for information, not for color. So therefore I changed this to the non-color space as well. And the bottom one is also not used for color, so I changed this to non-color, or we set it at the beginning already, going through the conversion of the normal map and going back. And this is the way how you can work with textures to set up your materials and creating realistic looking materials. The next step for us is to look at how to create materials procedurally, and that's the next step. So we're back at the scene and let's create a metallic material on this cube. The first thing that we want to do is create a material, and let's call this metal. And we are presented with the same node as we saw with the textures. And let me just make this a little bit larger. And what we will be using is the inputs of the base color, the input of the roughness, and the input of the normal, identical to what we've done with the textures. In this case, we also will be using the metallic slider, as this is a metallic material. It has a value, but it's either 0 or 1. So 0 for non-metallic, 1 for being metallic. And those are the 4 nodes we're gonna hook up. And let me just clear this and get back to the setup. The first thing that we notice is that this looks unrealistic, as it is a single color and almost all materials in the world have some variation in color. And what we can do is we can add some variation by pressing Shift A, and we can select a texture. And in this case, we are going to select a noise texture. But we cannot see what this texture is doing. So I want to go up here to edit, and let me just zoom in. Click on edit, click on preferences, and type in node or type in wrangler on the top. There is a node called node wrangler, and that allows you to see what a certain node is doing, how the influence is. So enable this, save it, or if you have autosave on, just close this. And if you go back down, and let me do the same thing, you can select a node, hold down Ctrl and Shift, and right now you can see the effect of this node on the object. So if I zoom in, you can see there is a scale of 5, and if I change the scale, you can see what the effect is of the change in value. The first thing that you notice is that this is a little bit vague. If I want to control more of the contrast, I can do a Shift A. I can go to Converter and I can add a color ramp. Let me just drop this in between. And if I move this slider, you can see I control the contrast of the noise texture a little bit better. So it gives me more control over this. So at least I have some variation in this scene already. But I think I want to add some more. So let me just go down here, press Shift A, and let me add a second texture, which let's use a Musgrave texture. I drop that in. Let's select it, Ctrl Shift and click on it. And this is the effect of this texture. And what I really want to do is I want to combine those so I get a nice gradient between the 2 textures. And I need to select Mix RBG. And that goes here. And now I can connect these 2 nodes up. And if I held Ctrl and Shift, you can see what the effect is. And I can change the values here just to get a nicer effect. And I'm just going to make this 4, 15. And these are the ones we will be using. And I'm just redoing those. And for the bottom ones, I think I will need the 1. Let me just make this into 1, 15 north and 2. And just by changing these values, you can see I get a lot of randomization on this cube already. So that's good. What I also want is I want these two textures to operate on the same coordinates. So this is maybe a little bit technical, but I want them to operate on the same texture coordinates. So I want them to go on the object and I want to go to object. So they are both there. Good. Let me combine these. I want to change this to darken just to get a little bit of a better result. And now I want to get the colors in place. I'm going to go to Shift A again. Let me just add a color ramp here again. And there we go. And you can see it's starting to look a little bit more like metallic already. Then we need the second one. So let me just copy this one and copy it down. I'm going to connect this up. I want the same texture to apply to the roughness, and I'm going to drop the roughness in as well. So as you can see, it's not very rough at the moment. You see I'm influencing how much of roughness is present, and I can control this also by using this slider. So just by controlling this, I can control the amount of roughness in the scene. We can change that in a sec. And the last one we want to hook up is the one to the normal, but I cannot use a normal map as I have a black and white texture right now, not a purple one. So right now I'm going to go to, and I can use the search bar as well. I'm going to add in a bump map. I'm going to hook that up. And I'm going to grab the same one here again, and I'm going to drop this in the height. And as you can see, I can change this as well, and I can control the height here. Let's change the values a little bit as the faction is still 1. I can control all of these materials by using these sliders. The one thing that I need to do to make it more realistic and look like metal, obviously, is controlling the final one, which is the metallic slider. Let's slide this all the way up to the right. And there we go. And as you can see, it's very dark. So let's change that a little bit. So if I move this out and I change this to a lighter version, I get a more realistic looking material. And if I go to the roughness, let's just make this a little bit lighter as well. This is too light, so let's make a nuance. Let's not make it too much of a difference. So I can control the roughness here as well. And obviously for the bump, I need it not to be so bumpy. And there we are. And in this case, it's very easy to create a more realistic looking material, and I can play around with all these settings to create a material which I really like. So I can change these values to give it a little bit of more contrast, to give it more of a color variation like I've done here. So I have my node set up where I can control the looks of the material by changing sliders and scale with all these different nodes which are available. This is a relatively easy node setup. If you want to take it a step further, those can become quite complex. If you're interested, advise you to visit YouTube and the channel of Ryan King. He has a lot of tutorials out there on this topic, on creating realistic materials. Another great source of information on the nodes used in Blender is the website blenderinsight.com. And if you go to the knowledge base nodes, there is a link here and it says Beginner's Guide to Cycle Nodes the Procedural Way. Clicking on it takes you to the page where each of the nodes is explained and how you can hook them up to create realistic materials. Very useful, very informative if you want to get more information on the nodes in Blender. Back in Blender, there is one definition I would like to discuss, and I think we have covered all the basic ones. We applied a texture on the bottom, which looks fine. But if I were to replace this metal material with the same one as we applied on the bottom, you see it looks quite well on the top and the side, but it is very wrong on the other side right here. The orientation is wrong, and it's the same on the other side. You see this one is going down and this one is not in line with the top one. And this has to do with the fact that the texturing is not sure how to present this on top of a 3D model. We need to unwrap the 3D object into a 2D object so we can apply the texture and then reapply everything back together. And let's take a look at how this works in a short animation, and then we can work with that as well. Let's try to apply the 2D texture that we downloaded, the stone one, on top of a 3D object using the texture and a cube like I showed before. If we just drop it onto a 3D object, what's gonna happen is that the computer or the software does not know how to apply this. As you can see, the top one looks fine, but then on the side it gets all crooked and bended, as well as the orientation is different on the front as on the left and the right, just as we saw in the example before. So we need to support the computer or the software how to orientate the 3D object, and how we can do it is through the use of UV unwrapping, and that means we have to open up or cut open the 3D object and lay it down as a 2D object, and we can view this as following. So let's take a look at the same cube again, and what we want to do is we want to open this up or cut open the top and lay it down as a 2D object. So lay it down on the floor. Then we are gonna apply the texture, and in this case we got the same texture again coming in from the top, and we're gonna place it over the 3D object which we just lay down as a 2D object. Then we can get all the orientation correct and the positioning as well, and once we have done that we can reapply them together so the orientation and the position of the texture on the 3D object is correct, and we can wrap it up to create a 3D object again.